They didn't lose at Hatton because America had bigger guns. They lost because of a mistake so small it never appeared on a map, so brief it existed only for seconds, a mistake no general noticed, no intelligence officer reported, one only a coal miner could see. Hatton did not survive because of American firepower. It survived because the Germans made a logistical error so subtle, so ordinary, and so invisible that it slipped past Allied intelligence, German armor commanders, and even post-war doctrine. The error created a gap in the assault that should never have existed, a gap measured not in meters but in seconds. This was not a failure of strategy. It was a failure born of exhaustion, ammunition rhythm, and blind spots inside German vehicle crews. No officer perceived it, no headquarters predicted it, but one soldier ejected by the army itself recognized the pattern instantly. He saw it because it looked exactly like a tunnel about to collapse. For years, deep in the coal seams of Illinois, he had learned how pressure behaves before disaster, how timing matters more than force, how a structure gives warning before it fails, and when German armor rolled toward Hatton, that same pattern revealed itself. That single insight allowed him to hold 2 command posts alone. It stalled 2 panzer battalions, and it altered the course of a battle that, on paper, should have been lost in less than an hour. Official documents buried his name where the army filed men who did not fit anywhere. Poor eyesight, unsuitable for combat, assigned to the mess section. Nothing in those neat lines reflected the reality of early 1945, when the U.S. Army was stretched thinner than at any point since landing in Europe, and every misjudged soldier was about to matter. On maps, the Western Front appeared stable. Back home, newspapers declared the war nearly won, but the maps were lying. Hitler's Ardennes counteroffensive had torn open the Allied line, and before that wound could close, a second blow followed farther south. Operation Nordwind, a strike designed to break the 7th Army, recapture Strasbourg, and split the front into 2 bleeding halves. German armor surged forward. American units, already drained to reinforce the Ardennes, now held miles of frozen ground with manpower they did not have and ammunition they could not spare. In that chaos, the army resorted to every warm body available. That is how a man the system had rejected found himself reassigned to the 42nd Infantry Division. He did not arrive because someone saw potential. He arrived because a hole needed to be plugged, and someone filling out a roster decided his career was expendable. When he first tried to enlist, his future ended before it began. A vision chart in a brightly lit room erased everything he imagined for himself. The recruiting officer barely looked at him when he told him to go home. The army had more volunteers than rifles. Why fight for a man who couldn't see clearly? But men who survive underground are not shaped by rejection. They are shaped by pressure. He tried again. He passed barely, and the army punished him for it by burying him in kitchens and corridors where nobody expected him to matter. He earned a reputation. Stubborn, argumentative, a discipline problem. The kind of man no commander wanted. The kind of man a system built on conformity had no use for. It was precisely the kind of man the battlefield was about to need. By December 1944, the 7th Army was in trouble. Units in Alsace were exhausted. Snowstorms drowned supply lines. Reinforcements were scarce. Commanders weren't looking for heroes. They were looking for men who could stand in the doorway while everyone else escaped through the back. When the battalion asked for 3 soldiers per company to guard the command post, his captain volunteered him instantly. It wasn't a promotion. It wasn't a chance. It was a disposal. Guarding a command post was a place for men who wouldn't be missed. Yet on the night he arrived, he immediately sensed something the officers inside the bakery turned headquarters couldn't feel. They studied maps lit by weak lamps, confident they had hours before the enemy reached Hatton. He listened to the silence outside, and the silence was wrong. Not the calm of a lull, but the quiet wait before something shifts. Miners feel that kind of silence in their bones. It's the warning breath before the ceiling begins to settle. He didn't need an operations briefing. He didn't need reconnaissance. His instincts told him the enemy was already in motion. He checked the Browning as naturally as men underground checked their lamps. Metal, feed tray, bolt, tension, not carefully. Instinctively, Hatton itself was a trap waiting to decide who it would consume. Narrow stone streets 4 to 6 m wide. Houses stacked 3 and 4 stories high. Frozen ground hard as armor plate, no moonlight, every angle magnified sound, compressed movement, and turned visibility into guesswork. German doctrine favored open ground and wide arcs for their armor. American doctrine favored coordinated fields of fire with infantry screening every approach. Hatton offered neither. It offered blind corners, confined movement, and the kind of suffocating geometry miners understand intimately. A space where the first mistake becomes the last. Inside those narrow lanes, the German assault cycle tanks forward, half-tracks behind. Infantry dismounting and pushing depended on perfect timing. But their crews were exhausted. Their radios were short-range. Their coordination relied on second-so-long exchanges that broke down easily. And inside steel hulls with limited visibility, those delays multiplied. What officers saw as a powerful, coherent German thrust, he recognized as something different, a structure under strain. He had spent 9 years listening for the first crack of a roof giving way. Now he heard that same tension echoing through the village streets. Then came the sound that confirmed everything, the faint metallic pulse of armored treads moving on frozen ground. Not loud, not dramatic, just the rhythmic pressure of something huge shifting its weight in the dark. Officers inside didn't look up. They thought the enemy was still hours away. He knew better. He'd heard this pattern before in tunnels when the ceiling began to shift in shafts where pressure built before anyone saw dust fall. A tank in a narrow street loses infantry cover the moment it enters. It moves blind, committed to the lane, unable to traverse quickly. Half tracks behind it must halt before dismounting troops, forcing soldiers into a predictable choke point. Each of those transitions, tank to half-track to infantry, creates a window not in meters, in seconds. A window no textbook identifies, a weakness no strategist highlights, a flaw no officer in Hatton recognized, but he recognized it immediately. It felt exactly like a tunnel beginning to let go. Pressure, delay, collapse. The sequence was identical, and when he leaned forward slightly, listening to the German machine approaching the edge of the village, he wasn't thinking like a soldier preparing to fight. He was thinking like a miner deciding whether the roof was about to come down. In that moment, he understood something the officers behind him could not. The Germans were about to walk straight into a timing gap they didn't know they had created. It was small, invisible, stupid, but real, and the man the army didn't want was the only one in Hatton who could hear it forming. The officers inside the bakery had not yet felt the thump of the first German shell, but the village already had. Hatton's stone walls carried vibrations long before they carried noise. The ground itself transmitted force like the rib cage of something alive. People who have never worked underground rarely notice it. People who have spent years listening for danger feel it before anyone speaks. He felt it now, a slight tremor, a distant metallic scrape. The way sound sharpened as it traveled through frozen stone. All signals that pressure was approaching the north entrance of the village. The staff officers were still bent over their maps, arguing the timing of German armor movement based on reports that were already out of date. They didn't understand that the battlefield communicates without radios. He did. He stepped outside into the cold, positioned himself behind the Browning, and waited. Hatton in Preed, on darkness, was a labyrinth of black shapes and sharp corners. The air froze breath into static. Every silhouette looked like a threat. Every alley felt like a dead end, but he wasn't relying on sight alone. Sight had never been his strong sense. He listened. At first, nothing. Then the faint pull of mass. A tank crawling forward at low speed, making just enough noise for someone trained to hear weight and friction to detect it. The shape emerged only when it was close enough to be fatal. It moved like a boulder, grinding through a tunnel, slow, deliberate, unstoppable. The silhouette bulged into the street, taller and wider than anything meant to fit between those walls. A German heavy tank, Tiger, maybe Panzer IV, possibly. It didn't matter, the physics was the same. Armor that thick couldn't be touched by 30 caliber fire. Firing at it would do nothing except announce his position and guarantee he died before sunrise. So he didn't fire. He let the tank pass him in the dark, its treads chewing ice, its exhaust a choking cloud drifting inches from his face. He watched it rumble deeper into the village, searching for the command post it would later attempt to obliterate. No infantry walked beside it. No grenadiers dismounted to clear corners. The tank was outpacing its own protection. An error, a small one, but small errors become fatal in confined environments. He waited again. 10 minutes later, a new vibration entered the stone. Lighter engines this time, multiple. He shifted his weight, leaned his cheek closer to the gun, and listened the way a miner listens to timber complaining under load. The sounds were separate strands of the same threat, the clatter of half-tracks, the rustle of men inside, the metallic slam of weapons being checked in the dark. 2 armored personnel carriers crawled into view, stopping 30 m from his position. Doors opened, boots hit ground. The half-tracks disgorged their infantry like veins bleeding soldiers, about 40 men in 2 waves. Panzer grenadiers moving the way trained infantry move, low, quick, synchronized. They assumed the street ahead was empty. They assumed the tank had cleared it. They assumed wrong. They advanced. 25 m 2015. He let them come, not out of courage, out of calculation. In mines, you never strike rock too early. You strike when the seam is exposed, when every swing does maximum work. The same principle applied here. The Browning was worthless if fired too soon, deadly if fired at the exact moment. When the shadows of their helmets dipped into the edge of his field of fire, he squeezed the trigger. The Browning erupted with a sound that belonged nowhere near the quiet streets of Hatton, a deep mechanical roar that flattened the front rank in a single blast. 50 rounds in roughly 6 seconds tore through the first 10 meters of the German advance. Bodies dropped instantly, collapsing into one another in a chain reaction of shock and surprise. Snow kicked up like powdered stone. Muzzle flash lit the street with strobing violence, and then darkness swallowed it again. The belt ran dry. He didn't panic. He didn't duck. He lifted the feed tray, shoved a fresh belt into place, and slammed the mechanism shut. 12 seconds. In those 12 seconds, bullets snapped past his head, slicing the air with supersonic cracks. He ignored them the way miners ignore falling dust. A warning, not a verdict. The gun roared again. Controlled bursts now, shorter, sharper. Each 46. Second burst cut down the grenadiers who tried to rush the sidewalls for cover. Their training worked against them. Doctrine demanded they press forward. The geometry demanded they die. Within minutes, the survivors were crawling back behind their half-tracks, shouting over each other, unsure where the fire was coming from. They had assumed they were the hunters. Instead, they were stuck in a stone chute with no exit and no visibility. For 2 hours, the street belonged to him. He fired sparingly when they probed. He fired heavily when they pushed. He shifted angle whenever bodies began creating uneven terrain in the kill lane. He was not thinking in terms of victory. He was thinking in terms of collapse. If pressure built too quickly on one side, the system failed. He had to keep the pressure-distributed infantry suppressed. Half-tracks stalled. Tank isolated somewhere deeper in the village away from supporting fire. That was the second twist of the fight. He wasn't just firing a machine gun. He was regulating the stress load on the enemy's advance the same way miners regulate the pressure on a weakening brace. At dawn, light crawled through the smoke and revealed what the night had hidden. German infantry massing, armor repositioning, a panzer moving to angle its gun at the bakery, dozens of bodies frozen where they fell. The street was now a trench of shattered uniforms and brass. He saw the danger instantly. If the tank acquired his position, it wouldn't matter how accurate his fire was. High explosives remove arguments. They remove walls. They remove timelines. He grabbed the Browning and its tripod close to 50 lb in total, and dragged it inside the bakery just as the tank fired. The shell struck exactly where he had stood, turning cobblestone into a crater, and the air into a hot mist of dust and shattered stone. Inside the bakery became a fortress by necessity, not design. He tore the gun off its tripod, lashed it to a heavy wooden table so recoil wouldn't walk it backward, and angled it through the narrow window toward the main street. He tested the pivot, tightened the wire, and braced his shoulder behind the stock. Then the rhythm of battle changed again. The Germans stopped pushing infantry and switched to indirect fire. Mortar rounds began dropping in calculated increments, first short, then closer still. He recognized the pattern instantly, not as a military tactic, but as the exact auditory signature of a collapsing mine. Small impact, bigger impact, fatal impact. He shifted position seconds before the final salvo hit. The blast shredding the wall he had just vacated. Dust exploded through the bakery. Light disappeared. The building groaned in its own language of stress and fracture. But he wasn't in the wrong spot when the ceiling began to sag. He was at the next window, the next angle, the next opportunity to keep the Germans off balance. It was only the first wave, and it had already cost them more men than any officer expected. The timing gap had appeared. He had attacked it without thinking. The Germans still didn't know it existed, but they would soon. And when they tried to correct it, the second wave would begin. The first wave had been repelled, but Hatton did not feel safer. In war, silence after violence is never relief. It is recalculation. The Germans had learned enough in the first assault to know two things. Their infantry alone could not breach the command post, and whoever was firing from the bakery understood the terrain in a way that disrupted their doctrine. That made him dangerous, and danger, once identified, is always prioritized. Dawn exposed the battlefield fully, and the German armor shifted its posture. Somewhere to the north, tank engines idled with the low growl of animals preparing to lunge again. Infantry regrouped behind stone walls. Officers barked orders. The assault had failed, but the objective had not changed. Destroy the American command post. Seize the village. Pry open the southern flank of Nordwind. He adjusted the Browning on the table, tightening the rope that held it in place. The gun had become an extension of the structure itself, bolted into the bakery like an improvised turret. The floor under him was no longer visible. It had disappeared beneath brass casings that clinked and rolled under his boots every time he shifted. The room smelled of cold air, cordite, dust, and the faint sweetness of baked bread still trapped in the stone from years before. Outside, German scouts tested the edges of the village, moving quietly. Too quietly, the kind of quiet that meant they expected resistance not from a squad, not from a platoon, but from something they had not classified yet, something that had killed too many men too fast. He listened again. The new rhythm was different. Not the heavy tread of armor, but the scattered, uneven footfalls of infantry feeling for weak points. Pressure testing like a roof settling under new weight. The enemy had traded brute force for intelligence gathering. They were learning. He had to learn faster. The next push came from a direction the Germans believed would bypass the kill lane. A narrow side street partially collapsed, barely wide enough for a man to move through. They assumed no American weapon of significance could cover it. They assumed the bakery's windows faced only the main approach. They assumed wrong. He rotated the Browning 70 degrees, braced the table leg against the wall, and fired the moment a column of helmets appeared at the far end of the rubble. The geometry turned against the attackers instantly. The confined space amplified each burst, the blast wave bouncing off the stone, trapping the German soldiers in their own echo chamber. They fell forward and backward simultaneously, collapsing into the rubble and blocking their own retreat. This wasn't marksmanship. This was architecture using angles, reflections, and choke points as weapons. Something miners understand intuitively. Stone shapes movement, and whoever shapes movement controls survival. The second wave recoiled. He knew the pattern was about to repeat. He also knew the Germans would escalate. When infantry cannot advance, they call steal. Minutes later, the bakery trembled again. Not from mortar fire this time, but from the deeper, heavier concussion of a tank positioning itself for a direct shot. The Germans had realized exactly where the machine gun was firing from, and that meant the next round would not bracket. It would attempt to erase the entire firing position. He pressed himself low, feeling the vibrations travel through the walls. The tank took its time. The crew wanted a perfect angle. The gun barrel would be elevating, adjusting, compensating for height and distance. He imagined the crew inside crowded, tired, breathing recycled air, arguing over direction, range, arc. Tanks were strong, but inside them every correction took seconds, and seconds mattered, more than meters. He moved before the shot came, not far, just enough. In mines, survival often depends on shifting your weight before the ceiling drops, not after. He slid the Browning to the next window, dragging the heavy wooden table, boots crunching on brass. 10 seconds, maybe 12, then the tank fired. The wall he had just abandoned exploded inward, dust swallowing the room. The concussion lifted him halfway off the floor and dropped him again. He coughed blood, dust, and the taste of chalked brick, but he kept moving, always moving. Outside, German infantry surged again, trying to exploit the shot. He answered with short bursts, conserving ammunition, forcing them back into the shadows. For a moment, they hesitated. Enough of them had died to understand that charging reflexively was suicide. Dusk crept in, and with it came the next transformation of the battlefield. German doctrine shifted. Once daylight vanished, they favored infiltration in darkness. Small teams moving quietly, testing windows, searching corners, slipping into gaps. In the black labyrinth of Hatton, a single misjudged alley could let an entire fire team reach the command post unnoticed. But darkness was his element. Underground, every shift was night. Every tunnel was a trap. Every footstep mattered more than every shadow. The bakery was not merely a defensive position. Now it was a sensor array. Every vibration through the floorboards, every change in the airflow of the hallway, every faint scrape of boot leather on stone. He leaned into the quiet and heard the danger forming long before it reached him. 2 Germans crept along the eastern wall, whispering. He could not see them, but he heard the small, distinct click of a safety lever being checked. He shifted, fired a 2. Kahn burst through the window at an angle so severe the rounds chewed into stone before sweeping the wall. A scream answered him. The infiltration halted. Another team tried the western approach minutes later. Same mistake, same result. They assumed the American machine gunner was stationary, predictable, anchored to one window like a traditional emplacement. They didn't understand that they were facing a man trained to relocate in collapsing spaces without waiting for orders. The night grew deeper, and the Germans resorted to mortars again. But this time he was ready for the rhythm. He rode the pattern, adjusting after each salvo. Always one window ahead of destruction. The bakery shook, cracked, sagged, but never closed over him. Hours blurred into exhaustion. His fingers bled from dragging the Browning. His eyes stung behind the cracked lenses he had wired together the night before. His ears rang from every concussion. Hunger gnawed him. Thirst clawed him. He found a broken bottle of wine on the floor, red liquid mixed with dust, brick powder, and the metallic tang of gun residue. He drank it anyway. It burned down his throat like punishment, but kept him alive. Then came the quiet, not the quiet of safety, the quiet of decision. German armor repositioned again. The shift in sound told him everything. A self-propelled gun, likely 75 or 88 mm, moving deliberately toward a firing solution. Its engine rumbled with a deeper timbre than a tank. Its suspension clattered differently. It was coming for him specifically. A gun like that wasn't fired at random angles. It was fired at problems. He braced for impact. He didn't need sight to know what would happen next. The gun fired. The shell hit the bakery with a force that didn't just shake the building. It threatened to move it off its foundations. The blast threw him across the room, ripping his glasses off, flooding his head with a ringing so severe he couldn't tell if he was still breathing. He crawled, blind, dizzy, feeling for the frames until his fingers found cold metal. He rewired the glasses by instinct, hands trembling, lungs burning. He forced them onto his face. The world returned in fractures. Another shot would finish the building. He had seconds. He dragged the Browning to the last intact window. Not because the shot mattered, the gun couldn't kill armor, but because firing would force the infantry to ground and buy him the only currency war still respected, time. He squeezed the trigger, sending a burst into the darkness. The Germans returned fire instantly, but hesitated to advance without armor support. That hesitation, tiny, foolish human, kept him alive. The second wave hadn't broken him. It had only set the stage for something far worse. The moment the 88 recalibrated its aim, the real collapse would begin. The first two waves had failed, but the Germans were not discouraged. Failure in a village like Hatton didn't mean stopping. It meant recalibrating. The German army did not excel at improvisation, but it excelled at escalation. Every setback unlocked a heavier tool. Every delay tightened the tempo. The battlefield was no longer a duel. It was a pressure chamber, a space where every second mattered, and every mistake amplified into catastrophe. He could feel it, not through sight, not through the tremor in the floorboards, but through the pattern of the enemy's breathing. Long deliberate pauses, followed by heavy metallic preparation. The self-propelled gun repositioned outside, its engine rumbling like a slow avalanche. The first round had torn through the bakery's wall, but failed to kill the one man it aimed for. The German crew would not accept that outcome twice. They were adjusting their angle, their range, their elevation. They wanted a direct hit at a window he had not yet abandoned. If they found it, the next blast wouldn't just destroy the room. It would carve a void into the building big enough to swallow the entire second floor. He dragged the Browning across the shifting piles of brass casings, boots slipping, shoulders burning. The gun was heavy, but exhaustion made it feel like pulling a rail cart uphill. Dust clouded the air, mixing with smoke and the stale smell of old flour embedded in the bakery's bones. The table scraped across the floor, leaving streaks in the snow-like layer of gunpowder residue. He set up at a new window, leaned into the frame, and listened. The next sound was not an engine. It was a voice, German, clipped, controlled, too close. The infiltration teams were back. Their orders were obvious. While the SB gun broke walls, infantry would slip through gaps and neutralize the machine gun that had already done the work of an entire platoon. They didn't know the American gunner could hear them through stone, picking their positions the way a miner picks where the next crack will form. He fired a short burst at an oblique angle, trusting sound and geometry more than eyesight. The round struck stone, then flesh. A shout echoed through the smoke, followed by scrambling footsteps. They'd been caught again not by sight, but by instinct. Darkness favored him, not them. The SB gun fired. The building absorbed the blow like a living creature taking a punch. Stone shattered, timber cracked, dust exploded in all directions. He ducked instinctively, bodily memory guiding him before thought could form. When the shock wave passed, he lifted his head, ears ringing hard enough to blur the edges of the world. He felt warm liquid on his cheek. Blood, maybe, it didn't matter. Nothing mattered except whether the gun still functioned, and whether the Germans were preparing to exploit the hole the SB round had just created. Seconds passed, not minutes, not moments, seconds. Enough for a trained infantry squad to cross a street. Enough for a Panzer Grenadier with an MP-40 to sprint into the Breirich. Enough for everything to end. He fired again, not at a target he saw, but at a space he calculated. The burst chewed through the dust, sending shards of brick and plaster into the air. German silhouettes appeared behind the haze, diving for cover. The SB gun reversed momentarily, repositioning. It was afraid of something it couldn't see. The Germans understood now that they weren't fighting a conventional emplacement. They were fighting a man who refused to stay where he was supposed to be. He changed windows again. 8 seconds, maybe 10. Each move cost more than the last. His breath came ragged. His throat felt raw. His back screamed from the concussive force of repeated blasts, but his hands stayed steady. They had learned steadiness in the coal seam, not on the battlefield. The next infiltration attempt came from inside the building. He heard them before they broke through boots scraping on broken glass. Muffled curses in German, the sound of someone sliding through debris. They had found a gap created by the SB gun's last shell, and were pushing into the lower level. If they reached the stairs, he would be cornered. He left the Browning only long enough to pull the pin on a grenade. Not fragmentation, white phosphorus. He tossed it down the stairwell, just as the first German helmet appeared at the bottom step. The detonation was not a blast. It was a bloom of violent burning chemistry. The screams were instant and terrible. He didn't flinch. Survival leaves no room for flinching. Smoke billowed up into the second floor, thick and acrid. His eyes watered behind the cracked lenses. He sucked in air through his sleeve, then returned to the Browning. Outside, German infantry were moving again, timing their assault with the chaos inside. He cut them down burst by burst, controlling his breathing the way he controlled his panic underground. Slow, deliberate, calculated. The SB gun fired again. This time, the shell hit lower, breaching the bakery's structural heart. The floor trembled, a joist snapped, dust cascaded like snow. The building was not merely damaged now, it was failing. The next impact could drop the entire second floor. He saw the angle of a support beam and knew instantly, without thinking, that he could no longer stay inside. Miners don't wait to see the ceiling fall. They move before the first slab drops. He grabbed the Browning by its barrel shroud, slung the ammunition belt around his torso, and ran. His boots pounded across the unstable floor. Each step felt like running on ribs. He burst through the back door into the frozen air, lungs seizing from cold and smoke. The Germans saw him immediately, and MG-42 opened fire, the sound like an electric saw ripping through metal. Bullets tore into the walls beside him, spitting splinters of stone. He slipped on ice, fell hard on his knee, gasped from the shock, then forced himself upright. He ran again. The gun on his shoulder felt like dragging a corpse. He sprinted through alleys, across ruined gardens, over churned snow, stained dark from battle. The world blurred into motion and sound. Shouts, engine blasts, distant artillery, the breath rasping in his chest. He didn't think, he moved. Movement was the only reason he had survived 9 years underground. Movement was the only reason he was still alive. Now the alternate command post finally rose ahead. A stone building with narrow windows and a door that seemed too small to save him. He stumbled inside, collapsing against the wall. Officers from another unit stared at him as if he were a ghost dragging the war itself behind him. He didn't speak. He didn't explain. He simply climbed the stairs, found a window, and set the Browning on the sill. The Germans had expected to kill a machine gunner in a bakery. Instead, they had inherited a machine gunner in an elevated stone fortress. He pulled in a breath that tasted like blood and smoke, steadied his hands, and fired. The second wave had collapsed. The third wave was beginning, and the timing gap, the invisible seam the Germans didn't know they carried, was about to widen into something catastrophic. The alternate command post was supposed to be safer, but safety was a fantasy. The moment he set the Browning on the window ledge, he knew the Germans would pivot the entire battle toward him again, not because they recognized him as a single threat, but because the battlefield geometry forced them to. Any American defense that refused to collapse became the center of gravity. Whether by design or accident, he had become the anchor point of Hatton, an outcome no officer ever intended, and no German plan accounted for. The enemy learned quickly. Within minutes of his arrival, armor repositioned. A Panzer IV angled its turret toward the new building, probing for a clear line of fire. Infantry began to mass again, moving through alleys and squads instead of waves. They were adapting. That alone made the air feel heavier. He fired a burst not to kill, but to test the environment. The rounds cracked through the cold air and struck stone, the echo returning to him like sonar. He listened to the rebound, judged the distance of the nearest wall, the density of the street, the likely cover positions. Every battlefield is a map of pressure points. This one was tightening around him. Downstairs, officers whispered urgently. Someone asked who he was. Someone else said they'd heard of a machine gunner who held the bakery alone. Someone said it was impossible. He ignored them. Their disbelief changed nothing. The Germans believed it now, and belief shapes behavior more than orders ever will. The next push came fast. German infantry surged from the eastern street, using tank cover to advance. They moved with more discipline this time. Short rushes overlapping fields of fire. Grenadiers coordinating MG-42 bursts to pin potential firing angles. The kind of assault meant to break morale before it broke bodies. He answered with pure mechanics. 4. See second-dawned bursts. 6. Second pauses. Fire, recalibrate, fire again. Each cycle shaved seconds off his remaining ammunition supply. The belt rattled across the sill like a living creature slowly dying. He could feel its weight diminishing, each fired round a countdown ticking in brass. The Panzer IV roared forward, its gun depressed. It was hunting him specifically now. If it got closer, the main gun wouldn't need precision. A single high-explosive round at point-blank range could erase the entire second floor of the building. He waited until the tank halted to adjust its aim. Then he fired at the German infantry clustered behind it. The rounds could not harm the tank, but they killed the men depending on it. The Germans pulled back again. Even armor is exposed when the soldiers behind it fall. He breathed shallowly, forcing air through lungs that felt bruised. His ears still rang from the SB gun. His glasses were smeared with dust and blood. The world fragmented at the edges, but his hands didn't shake. Not yet. He switched windows. The movement felt slower this time, as if his body were wading through wet cement. The Browning slammed onto the stone sill just as a German squad attempted to flank from the west. He rad the street with a burst that dropped 3 instantly and scattered the rest. Their retreat was frantic, disordered. The Germans were no longer advancing with confidence. They were advancing by necessity. Then he felt it. The building shifting, not visibly, not dramatically. A subtle change in the way the stone transmitted vibration. The floorboards flexed under his boots. The window frame creaked in a tone that told him the walls had absorbed too much stress. The bakery had nearly collapsed when the beams failed. This building was stronger, but nothing built by men withstands this much violence indefinitely. He fired again, using shorter bursts now, trying to conserve ammunition. But conserving ammunition only delays the inevitable, and the inevitable was approaching fast. The belt was nearly gone. He didn't count the rounds. Counting implies planning, and planning fails under extreme conditions. Instead, he felt the end of the belt bump against his left hand, the way a miner feels a seam thinning before it disappears. Then came the first true breaking point. The tank changed its behavior. It lunged forward suddenly, closing distance at a reckless speed. A tank does not do that unless commanded by someone desperate or someone who finally understands the danger of letting a single machine gunner dictate the tempo of an entire sector. The 75 mm gun lifted, searching for an angle into the second floor. If it found it, the battle would end instantly. There would be no surviving the blast, no crawling away from it, no running through smoke. It would turn the room into a cavity of burning air. He drew in a breath, forced his vision to focus through the cracked lenses, fired one last burst, not at the tank, but at its escorting infantry. The rounds cut down 2 soldiers who were preparing to sprint toward the doorway below him. Their bodies dropped hard onto the frozen street. Then the belt ran out. The last link clinked against the receiver and slid from his fingers. The Browning went silent. Silence is different in battle. It doesn't feel like absence. It feels like exposure. He crouched instinctively, waiting for the Germans to capitalize on the void, waiting for the tank to fire, waiting for the floor to vanish under him. But the Germans hesitated, not long, barely seconds, but hesitation is time, and time is power. He reached for the ammunition box, empty. He felt for a second box, nothing. His hands closed on fragments of belt, loose casings, splinters of wood. He scanned the floor, heartbeat pounding against his ribs. No more belts. He was alone with a dead machine gun and a panzer aiming at his window. Another soldier might have surrendered to that moment. Not out of cowardice, but recognition. Recognition that physics, mathematics, and probability had all converged into a singular truth. His fight should be over, but miners don't stop working because the seam dries. They shift, they adapt. He grabbed the nearest weapon, a grand rifle, dropped by a wounded soldier downstairs, and moved back to the window, not to challenge the tank, but to deny the infantry the final approach. He fired once. The ping of the Garand's clip echoed across the street like a strange, defiant bell. He fired again and again, each shot slower, more deliberate, using every ounce of discipline he had learned underground. Steady hands, controlled breathing, patience overriding fear. The Germans recoiled. A tank cannot enter a building alone. Infantry must lead, but infantry would not advance into a kill zone controlled by a man who refused to die. The officers behind him realized only then what he had been doing. He wasn't holding a position. He was buying time. The staff needed minutes, just minutes to evacuate, regroup, and fall back without leaving bodies and documents behind. Minutes they would not have had if he had broken earlier. One officer shouted that they were retreating, that he needed to follow, that no one expected him to stay. He didn't argue, he didn't speak. He simply kept firing until the last of them escaped out the rear. The tank fired. The blast hit the building like a hammer swung by a giant. The floor tilted. The ceiling cracked open. He was thrown sideways, slamming into the stone wall hard enough to black out for a moment. When he inhaled again, the air tasted of plaster and blood. The Browning was destroyed, shattered beyond recognition. He was not. German infantry surged a final time. Believing the shot had killed him, he forced himself upright, chest heaving, vision wavering. He reached for whatever weapon remained. 3 white phosphorus grenades. He pulled the pins with numb fingers and hurled them into the street just as shapes approached the doorway. White fire blossomed. Screams followed. The street emptied. He did not feel triumph. Only the pounding of his pulse and the weight of the moment. The Germans had pulled back, not defeated, resetting, reassessing, preparing the next escalation. But the timing gap had widened. Their cohesion was fraying, their coordination unraveling. He had held again, and the battle was shifting into something even more dangerous. A final stand where the line between survival and annihilation would vanish completely. Smoke choked the final burst of white phosphorus, drifting through the ruined street like a poisonous fog. For a moment, just a moment, the battlefield paused, not because the Germans were defeated, but because they had been forced into the one state their doctrine never tolerated. Uncertainty, something inside their assault sequence had broken. Something invisible, something no report would ever describe correctly, but he could feel it, the rhythm of their attack. The timing gap he had sensed from the first minute had widened so far that even the men charging forward could not bridge it anymore. He leaned against the shattered frame of the window, chest rising and falling in jagged breaths. His back felt aflame where shrapnel had torn through his jacket. His ears rang so violently he wasn't sure whether the explosions outside were real or phantom echoes. Sweat froze on his skin as quickly as it formed. His glasses, wired, cracked, clouded, held together only through stubbornness. He wasn't winning. He wasn't surviving. He was enduring. There is a difference. Outside, German voices regrouped behind the cover of tanks and debris. They were shouting over one another, struggling to impose order. Officers barked commands that cut through the chaos, trying to reset the assault before American reinforcements could arrive. But something had changed. Their confidence was gone. The predictable cadence of their advance had fractured. War is not mathematics. It is momentum, and Hatton's momentum no longer belonged to them. He slung the Garand and crawled to the opposite window, dragging his battered body like a man crawling through a caving shaft. Every movement hurt. Every breath tasted metallic, but he moved anyway. Miners do not stop when pain arrives. They stop when stone does, and the stone had not stopped him yet. He raised the Garand and scanned the street. Shapes blurred through smoke. German infantry regrouped, their silhouettes ghost-like behind shifting curtains of gray. Some pointed toward his window, others hesitated, unsure whether he was still alive after the tank's last shot. Hesitation kills more effectively than bullets. He fired once. A silhouette fell. The Garand's clip pinged sharply, an unmistakable sound that cut through the battlefield like a declaration. He reloaded, fired again. Then he heard it, the grinding, purposeful approach of another armored engine. Not the Panzer IV this time. Something heavier, more deliberate. A self-propelled 88mm gun returning for a kill it had failed to achieve in the bakery. The deep, resonant clatter of its tracks vibrated through the stone walls. He didn't need to see it. He knew its purpose. It stopped close, too close. He stepped back from the window, gripping the wall for balance. The air tightened. The pressure changed. Even without sight, he could feel the barrel being lowered into alignment with the structure. The gun wasn't trying to hit him. It was trying to vaporize the room. The shot came. Light, sound, pressure. The shell detonated inside the building, turning the air into a shock wave that lifted him off the ground and threw him across the stone floor. He hit the opposite wall and collapsed, limp, vision smearing into fractured whiteness. For seconds, he didn't breathe. He didn't think. His body simply refused to respond. Then instinct returned. He gasped, rolled to his side, coughing violently. Blood trickled from his ears. His left hand wouldn't close properly. His legs trembled, but he was alive barely. The machine gun he had carried for 2 days was gone, torn into worthless fragments across the room. The Browning that had anchored both command posts was dead. The Germans believed he must be dead as well. He heard movement outside the cautious, predatory steps of infantry advancing behind the 88. They were coming to finish what the gun had started. His vision blurred when he tried to focus, but he could still see shapes through fractured lenses. He forced himself upright, scanning the floor, searching for anything, any weapon, any tool, any chance. His fingers closed around the last thing he expected, another soldier's rifle. A Gare ended again, half buried under shattered wood. He gripped it, pulled it to him, checked the chamber by feel, loaded, boots approached the doorway. He rose. When the first German appeared, he fired. Then again, moments stretched into a violent blur as he fought not for victory, but to survive long enough for the others to escape. He fired until the clip ejected with its familiar metallic ping. Reloaded, fired again. The Germans staggered, then faltered, then withdrew behind smoke and rubble. Behind him, an officer shouted that the command post was evacuating. They were pulling out the final order, the last fallback. Hatton was breaking. They couldn't hold the position any longer. Men ran down the hall carrying wounded, carrying documents, carrying the last remnants of command structure. They told him to move. They ordered him to move. He didn't. He fired again. One shot, then another. He stayed because someone had to stay. And in the logic of collapsing systems, it wasn't heroism. It was structural necessity. His staying made their leaving possible. It wasn't long before the world outside changed again. A new pattern in the soundscape, a deep rumble, distant but growing, tanks but not German, engines with a different timbre, tracks grinding in a different cadence. Reinforcements breaking through, the 79th Infantry Division, elements of the 42nd, American armor roaring forward through the wreckage of Hatton. The German assault began to fracture, then dissolve. The infantry fell back. The 88 reversed, black smoke rising from its hull. Artillery shifted, the battlefield's weight tipped. He collapsed onto the floor, the Gare, and slipping from his fingers, he didn't hear the reinforcements enter the building. He didn't hear the shouts, the boots pounding up the stairs, or the voices calling his name. He didn't even hear the medic who knelt beside him, checking for a pulse. His world had narrowed to the cold stone beneath him, and the sound of his own rattled breathing. When he opened his eyes again, soldiers stood above him, astonished, speechless. They found him still gripping the ruined machine gun's handle, as if refusing to let go, even after the weapon itself had died. Around his boots lay thousands upon thousands of brass casings, piled so high they reached his ankles. His glasses were cracked, the wire holding them together twisted into a desperate knot. His face was a patchwork of dust, blood, and grit. He had survived 48 hours of continuous combat alone, except for the first hours. Without water, with a gun he wasn't trained to use. Against forces, no doctrine said one man should ever stop. 40 confirmed German dead near his firing positions. Likely far more men evacuated by their comrades during the lulls he had denied them. 517 Americans saved, withdrawn without capture, without classified documents lost. Hatton held long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Operation Nordwind faltered. Strasbourg remained in Allied hands. In the aftermath, officers wrote reports, commanders wrote citations, generals wrote commendations, but none of them captured the truth. None of them understood that he had not won through firepower or accuracy or luck. He had won because he recognized the flaw in the German assault, the tiny, stupid, invisible timing gap, and widened it into a chasm with nothing more than will and instinct. Months later in Washington, President Truman placed the Medal of Honor in his hands. He accepted it quietly. Eisenhower asked for a private conversation afterward. No record exists of what they discussed. He lived 2 more decades, worked, married, raised a family, never spoke of Hatton unless asked. And whenever people wondered how a coal miner rejected by the draft held off 2 Panzer battalions alone, he answered the same way. All I did was try to keep other soldiers from being killed. 100. He never said the truer part, that when everything else failed, plans, doctrine, logistics, command, it was a single man's instinct shaped in the dark 600 FD underground that held the line long enough to change the fate of hundreds. History likes to pretend that wars are decided by sweeping strategies, brilliant generals, perfect maneuvers, maps with arrows, reports with numbers. But Hatton was not saved by a strategy. It wasn't saved by firepower or doctrine or planning. It was saved because one man saw something the rest of the battlefield missed, a tiny fracture inside the German attack, a flaw so narrow and so accidental that no textbook ever bothered to teach it. A seam measured not in meters but in seconds. That seam should never have mattered. It should never have been noticed. It should never have been exploited. But it meant the one man whose entire life had been spent listening for the first crack in a collapsing world. A soldier the army didn't want. A cook they tried to sideline. A miner they assumed was useless. And yet, in those 48 hours, that miner understood the battlefield better than the officers commanding it. He understood that German armor, for all its engineering, still relied on human rhythm. He understood that infantry, for all their discipline, still hesitated when vision failed. He understood that timing tiny, stupid human timing breaks machines as easily as rock. He didn't need theory. He didn't need orders. He didn't need perfect eyesight. He only needed to listen. Hatton's survival was not a miracle. It was not luck. It was the collision of a flaw in the German assault with a lifetime of instinct buried 600 FT underground. And when those two forces met, the result was inevitable. A man the army had judged as weak became the only structure that didn't collapse. 517 men walked away because he didn't. When historians look at Hatton, they see a Medal of Honor citation. When soldiers look at Hatton, they see a stand. No one should have survived. But when you look closely past the explosions, past the numbers, past the legend, you see the real truth. Sometimes the smallest failure in the enemy is enough. If the right man hears it first, and on those 2 days in January 1945, in a village torn apart by fire and stone, that man was Vito Bertoldo.